Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there today in person. Sounds like a really fun meeting. So today I've been asked to talk about some new ideas about the Platonic space. So what I thought I would do is specifically talk about the kinds of free lunches that I think the Platonic space offers. You can look at some of my recent talks that are on our channel online about what the Platonic space is. I kind of assume that people have some idea of what I'm talking about, but you can find all that on our channel. So the basic idea is this: nowadays with the standard paradigms, we have three typical ways of putting in effort to make something that is competent, whether that's a controller for a robot or for some sort of computerized process or a biological system. You want a biological system that is adaptive to some particular environment. You know, it's successful, it does a good job in that environment. For any of those things, we have three basic ways of putting in effort. First of all, we can design it, meaning rational engineering. We can use evolutionary search, meaning that you don't actually know how to design it, but you generate a huge number of variants, you test them, throw away everything that doesn't work, and you do cycles of that. So that's evolutionary search. Or you can train it. So if you have a system that can learn, you expose it to the problem multiple times, and then eventually, hopefully, it learns, right? Those are the ways we pay for having something that does a good job. So typically we think that that's it. That's basically where competency and intelligence and those kinds of things come from. So I'm going to try to put some stress on that idea and suggest that there's actually something missing here. There's another class of origin story for those kinds of things that we don't yet pay enough attention to. So let me take you through some examples. Suppose I wanted a tadpole that could form an eye on its tail, and then I want it to be able to see out of that eye. I don't want it to connect to the brain. I just want it to be able to see out of that eye. Oh, and by the way, when the tail decays, when the tadpole turns into a frog, I want that eye to know that it's different than the tail and not die. The rest of the tail cells will undergo cell death. I want the eye to ignore that completely. How would I engineer that? What would I need to do? I mean, we have standard tadpoles that have evolved under standard selection pressure to have a certain developmental sequence with eyes in their heads connected to the brain. They're nowhere near tissue that degrades during disappearance of the tail. All that. How would I modify all of that to make it work? What would I need to do? So you can take a moment, think about all the incredible coordinated changes that would have to happen for this design spec. Turns out, no, you don't need to do any of that. If you do put a bunch of eye cells on the tail, they still go ahead and they form an eye. They do not connect to the brain. They may be synapse on the spinal cord, sometimes not at all, but they certainly don't go up to the brain. And if you check the behavior of those animals, they can see out of these eyes. Okay, so no primary eyes, just the eye on the tail. We put them in the machine. They can learn. They can learn visual cues. So that's pretty wild. You don't need new rounds of selection, mutation, adaptation to make an animal with a radically different sensory motor architecture. It just works immediately, zero shot, like right out of the box. And also, when that tail dies, in fact, yeah, the eye already knows it's different, basically ends up just riding up, lands on the butt of the frog, and there it stays, ignores the cell death cues. Amazing. Why does any of that work in this novel kind of novel scenario? Okay, let's get even crazier. Suppose I wanted to take a shy, slow reptile. I have this turtle. I want to give it a playful, cat-like speed of life. Well, what would we need to do? I mean, ostensibly, you're thinking millions of years of evolution to turn this reptile into a mammal like a cat. Maybe some crazy neuroengineering that nobody has any idea of how to do. Well, this guy put a turtle on a little skateboard and basically unlocked the fact that, yeah, the turtle already does this. It immediately understands what's going on. It can operate at the speed, basically at the speed of the cat. It wants to play. It's trying to interact with the cat. The cat's seems a little freaked out by it, but the turtle's all over this. So apparently, even a tiny adjustment to that physical embodiment unlocks a whole new cognitive domain. That skateboard was a passive material. It's not even smart on its own. What is the latent space of possibilities for this animal? I mean, have turtles been hanging around for millions of years, having this incredible capacity, just wishing they could run around at that speed and play? And what could humans and Xenobots and everybody else do with simple prosthetics, right? Where does this come from? Where does this capability come from? Okay, Let's look at below. Let's look at the material of life. We are all made of molecular circuits, so networks of molecules that turn each other on or off. So we can model those with these kind of networks, for example, gene regulatory networks. And what we found some years back is that we can train gene regulatory networks by choosing certain nodes and stimulating them, and choosing other nodes as the response node, and we read out of them. We can find things like habituation, sensitization, and in fact Pavlovian conditioning. So you can actually do this kind of associative learning experiment where you associate a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, and eventually it becomes a conditioned stimulus and it turns on the response by itself. Amazing. Also, we found that some networks, when you do this, when you train them, they rise in causal emergence. Causal emergence just basically quantifies the degree to which the whole is more than the sum of its parts. In other words, to what extent does the network have its own center of control over and above anything the lower levels are doing. So here's what we would like. I want higher causal emergence to make for better learning, but I want learning to raise causal emergence. In other words, I want a feedback loop. And by the way, I want this feedback loop to be asymmetric. I want it to be I want this feedback loop between learning and causal emergence to point in the direction of greater intelligence and greater agency. Meaning that if I force the network to forget something that it's already learned, I do not want to lose the gains in causal emergence that I found. How in the world would I find such networks? I mean, you might imagine that if that's even possible, they would be very rare, and biology, maybe evolution selected for such things. How do we find them? I just want to point out that so this is William Paley, and William Paley back in the day made this argument that when you find complexity, in his case it was called the watchmaker argument. When you find a watch in the middle of the forest, you have to assume a watchmaker. Why? Because order is rare. You don't just find watches that most of what happens is junk. And then if you find something that isn't junk, you have to look for an origin story. You have to figure out what happened. And so of course he suggested that God did it, so a pre-existing rational engineer. Darwin had a different idea. He said, no, you can get to the same thing by multiple rounds of generate and test, so a replication with errors and then selection. But they both agreed on one thing. They didn't agree on the origin of the order, but they did agree that order is incredibly rare and that it requires extraordinary effort. You need an amazing story for how these things get here. So it turns out that if we ask this question, these networks, what percentage of the random networks, not evolutionarily designed, but random networks, have this incredible property that I was just telling you about? Turns out that the random networks already are incredibly close to being optimized. In other words, that intelligence agency ratchet is a free gift from mathematics. You don't need it doesn't require any facts of physics to explain it. It is not about biology, because we didn't select anything in this case. We didn't look at specifically just biological networks. We also analyzed random networks. And what we found is that basically the random networks are already optimized for a unidirectional drive for intelligence and agency. This is remarkable. This is Federico Pagosi's paper that should be pre-printed soon. So one could ask whether the Platonic space, which is the space of patterns that determines certain facts of mathematics, for example, so the properties of networks, the properties of causal emergence, information theory, math, is it fine-tuned like our physical universe is fine-tuned? Those cosmological arguments about why the constants of physics are so specially selected to be compatible with matter and life and all of that. So that's kind of amazing, right? So what I'm showing you here is examples where you get a lot of order for free. And it's not just order. These aren't just patterns in Stu Kaufman's sense. He's kind of the granddaddy of some of the stuff from the 90s about order for free. But what you get for free are actually pretty remarkable competencies that have a lot to do with the nature of life and mind. So let's keep going. Suppose we wanted an autonomous motile organism which should contain no neurons. I want it to make copies of itself from material it finds in the environment. I want it to be able to hear, and I'm only going to use wild-type cells that come from a frog. In other words, genetically unaltered frog cells. What would I need to do to engineer that? If I had said this to you in 2017, you would rightfully have made a list of all kinds of synthetic biology and bioengineering steps that would have to be undergone to make all this happen. Turns out, nope, don't need to do any of that. If you just take some skin cells from an early frog embryo, they don't and sort of liberate them. They don't die. They don't crawl away from each other. They don't form a two-dimensional monolayer. What they do is they make these little creatures we call Xenobots, which then will run around, collect loose epithelial cells, polish them into little balls, which then continue to mature into Xenobots, which then make the next generation, the next. So they already have, they have self-assembly, they have kinematic self-replication. Turns out they can hear. We found out that if you put a speaker underneath them, they respond to the sound. So they do something that the frog embryos do not do. I mean, they don't do this either, but they don't. They have this unique hearing capacity. Maybe I'm bored with the circular motion and I wanted to swim in more complex patterns. All right, well, there it is. All we did there was shove a bunch of neurons in there. So frog neurons randomly stuck in there. They form some kind of a neural network with a specific structure, and then you get novel behaviors like this. And maybe I'd like this thing to have information architectures resembling that of human brains. Of course, there's no neurons in there, but I don't care. I want this thing to have some kind of a information architecture that by certain metrics looks like human brains. Okay? If we look at the calcium signaling in these epithelial cells, we find out that compared to their null models, basically similarly different from null models than as our fMRI data of human brains. And this is measuring integrated information. So. And then the final thing is, well, if we're going to have all this, then we might as well ask for them to form memories. We want them to have a record of their experiences. What would you need to do? Nothing. You don't need to engineer in anything. These little blobs of skin already do that. This is Pai's forthcoming paper showing that they can distinguish two different stimuli, and then they bear the signatures of their exposure for up to 24 hours, maybe longer, we don't know, but at least 24 hours in their physiological networks, in their behavior, and in their gene expression. So they have multiple ways of remembering things that they've seen. Remember, again, we did not teach them to do any of this, so we didn't train them. We didn't engineer them. All we do is take the cells out and put them in the same salt water that we raise embryos in, and we didn't select them to do this. In fact, there hasn't never been any Xenobots. There's never been any selection to be a good Xenobot or to do any of this. So you start, I'm just hammering the same ideas. Like, where do these things come from? So suppose I want the same thing, but this time I'm not even going to use embryonic cells. Forget the embryonic plasticity. I want this made out of adult cells. I want it to be able to heal neural wounds. Maybe I would like it to be made of mammalian cells, so that we don't have any advantages of the of amphibian plasticity. What would I do? Nothing. We can take these cells out of your body. So these are adult tracheal epithelial cells removed from adult human patients. In culture, they go together to form this little thing we call an Anthrobot. By looking at this, you would never be able to guess what genome it has, which is 100% normal Homo sapiens. By looking at the human genome, you would never be able to tell that they're able to do this. Where do all these things come from? Oh, we wanted neural repair. Fine. We grew a lawn of human neurons, so these are iPS-derived neurons. We took a scalpel, put a big scratch through the center, sprinkled on some Anthrobots. They assemble at certain positions in the scar, in the wound rather, and then they sit there, and over about 4 days they knit together the edges of the wound like this. Okay, so they already have this capacity. Do we train them to do this? No. Have there ever been any Anthrobots selected to do this? No. Do we engineer something to enable them to do this? Nope. This is just these are spontaneous capacities that we unlock when we ask the question of what is something capable of. Oh, and suppose I want them to reverse their aging. I'm not going to use any Yamanaka factors, no reprogramming factors. I don't even want them to have reprogramming factors, but I want them to go back in time for their aging. Done. They do that. The Anthrobots are actually younger. So by epigenetic clock, Anthrobots are actually younger than the cells they come from. So okay, now things are getting really sharp. we have a bunch of competencies. So for example, here's the frog genome, normal frog developmental series, normal tadpoles. Okay, we know when we paid the computational costs to design these things. It was during the eons that the frog genome was bashing against the environment, making novel beings, testing, generate, and test in parallel, trillions probably of examples. When did we pay the computational costs to make a Xenobot? Right here, they have their own developmental sequence. They have certain competencies like hearing and kinematic self-replication and learning and some other stuff. When did they acquire those? How did they acquire those? When do we pay the computational cost of those? So at this point, and by the way, you can't simply say that, well, you also got all of this when you were selecting to be a good frog, because that basically rips up the whole point of evolutionary theory, which is supposed to paint you a very high specificity picture between the features that a being has now and the series of environments whose selection pressures have sculpted it. If you don't have any of that specificity, if you can just get anything by selecting for anything, then the whole predictive value of evolutionary theory is out the window. So something very strange is going on here. Biology is doing something very weird. And because of this, a lot of people think that what we need to do is a kind of bio-inspired engineering. So the idea is biology does something amazing, sometimes using brains, sometimes using so-called blind evolution, and we need to use whatever the heck it's doing to inspire our technologies. Our technologies are dumb, they're mechanical, they don't have the benefit of whatever this magic is that allows us to gain competencies in biology without paying for them in traditional means. So whatever that is, we're going to try to put that, sort of engineer that into our creation. So what I want to do now is just tell you very quickly that I think this picture is wrong, and this idea that biology is magic, but our so-called machines, I'm not sure there are any machines anymore, our so-called sort of low-level creations don't have the benefit of this. I think that's wrong. So this is some work that we've done recently. And there's a lot more coming on this, but I'm just going to talk about the published work right now. Suppose I want a short, transparent, deterministic algorithm that was designed for assumptions of reliable hardware. In other words, it doesn't contain any code whatsoever to check whether its steps have been executed properly. You know, when you write an algorithm, typically you assume that the steps get executed, but occasionally you might worry about whether your hardware is actually working correctly, and so you put in all kinds of checks, right? You put in checkpoints to say, okay, I told you to do this, did you actually do it? And anything that operates on the outside world, for example, needs those kinds of things. Okay, so I want a short deterministic algorithm. I want it to only have the steps that assume reliable hardware, so no checks for anything going wrong. But I also want it to work when commands occasionally fail. I want that for nothing. I want it to be able to deal with broken material without putting in any code that would actually handle it. Also, I want something else for free. I want it to do something else that's interesting. While it's doing the thing I've asked it to do, I also want it to do something completely different. For example, Chris Fields and I had this theory of multicellularity that says that the reason cells stick together is that if your goal is to minimize surprise, the least surprising thing in the environment is you. In other words, yourself, a copy of yourself. So if you make a daughter cell and you can keep those daughter cells sitting around you, then you can have a much more predictable environment because they're easier to predict than the weird things that happen in the wild world. So that's a possible theory of multicellularity. And it's an example of what they call homophily, which is just the tendency of similar biologicals to kind of stick together. You know, living things like to stick together with other things of their own kind. So okay, so suppose I wanted a small algorithm. I wanted to do something even when the hardware fails. And by the way, I also wanted to implement homophily. Not going to put any code into it. How about this? If I'm getting all that for free, one more thing. I wanted to also do delayed gratification. That is, as it's working, I want to see that it can pass the marshmallow test. In other words, go backwards from your goal in order to recoup bigger gains later on. I mean, that's a fairly sophisticated, you know, they test human children on this. That's a fairly sophisticated kind of a competency. I want all of that, but I'm not adding any code for it. I refuse. I'm just going to use a few lines of code for this deterministic algorithm. I want all of this stuff for free. No problem. Turns out Bubble Sort already does all of that. I don't have time to get into all this here, but if you read this or a couple of my blog posts about it, you will see what I'm talking about. Simple old bubble sort. If any of you are CS type people, all of you studied this thing in CS 101. About 80 years, people have been studying this thing. Nobody noticed that it until what 2018 or something. That oh no, 2024. Sorry. That it does all this for free. These things are not in the code. The code is obvious. It's not like biology where there's always some kind of quantum, microtubule or something that's doing something that you don't know. There's always more mechanisms. Not here. You can see all the code. You know what all the code is, and yet it's doing these novel things. Okay. So final example. I want a good controller for a robot. I don't want to write any new code. I don't want to train anything. I don't want to evolve anything. I don't want to do any computations. I don't want to write any new code. I just want it to be good. I mean, that sounds crazy, right? That is not how we, that's not how we create robots or algorithms or anything like that. We put in effort. We sweat and we bleed to either train them or evolve them or engineer them if we know how. I don't want to do any of that. I just want it to be good without any of that. So what can I do? Well, if I can't do any of this, I'm just going to run the robot off of existing data. I'm going to get an existing data set from somewhere. I mean, that data set's going to be completely irrelevant to the problem I want to solve because, if I'm not allowed to change anything, I can't guarantee that the data is useful. I'm just going to take random data that has nothing to do with anything. That's my controller for a robot. Okay. It sounds crazy. Sounds like there's no way that's going to be useful. Well, this is the paper by my student, Emily Ertl. And this is just the beginning. There's going to be a lot more, where basically we found out that if you take data from random sources, so from mathematical objects like fractals, from human-derived objects like rasterized paintings, from signals from bacteria, from the cosmic microwave background radiation, and you use the bits in these things to run a robot, nothing else. No neural network, no decision-making, no sensors, no learning, nothing. And you use these things to explore a maze, for example, or to play Ms. Pac-Man or any of these other things that she's doing. Turns out you get reasonable performance. You don't get incredible performance, like you don't beat humans, but you get decent performance, and by the way, better performance than random sequences. So what is going on here? How do we get anything that we didn't put any effort into? Why do non-specific patterns have some sort of actionable intelligence on new problems? So finally, here's what I think is going on. When we talk about inspiration in genius humans, what we're labeling is the distinction between the way that normies sort of solve problems laboriously, step by step. They put in the effort, they do the derivations step by step by step, versus somebody who's a genius who wakes up one morning and says, oh yeah, I can see the answer. I don't need to go through all the steps. I can see it immediately. Whether they get a poem, a symphony, the answer to some scientific problem, you pose something to somebody like von Neumann, you don't need to. He doesn't need to go through all the steps. He knows exactly what the answer is. If you're Ramanujan, then your experience is that a Hindu goddess whispers theorems in your ear. You don't have to go through all the steps of learning how to derive them. What we're quantifying here is the difference, the delta between the effort put in and what you get out. And what I'm showing you is examples. I'm showing you examples in biology and in minimal computational systems where what you get out is way more than what you put in. That, to me, is basically the broader class of this notion of inspiration. And so, yes, human brains and bodies are the beneficiaries of certain patterns for which we don't pay for in conventional ways. So patterns, policies, capabilities. Okay, great. We get inspired sometimes from somewhere that we don't know from where. But don't feel too pleased with yourself, because even cells and even quote-unquote dumb machines do it too. They have the opportunity to do it too. And so this is part of my program of research on this latent space of the patterns, not just static patterns, but behavioral policies, various competencies that come from this space. So mathematical objects are just kind of one layer of this space. I've been calling it the Platonic space. It has some similarities with that theory and some differences, but we can ask, right? Like we already know there's amazing the truths of number theory and some other cool stuff that lives there. But what else lives there? What else is in this space that we can basically channel for free if we make the right kinds of embodiments? And sometimes those embodiments are just putting a skateboard on a turtle, and sometimes they're more complex. So what I actually think is happening here is not that biology has something that we're going to copy with our technology, but this idea that both biology and technology are inspired by, literally inspired by ingressions from this space of patterns. And that is what we're missing in our traditional ways of accounting for effort, is the ingressions from this space. So I've called them free lunches in the physics sense, to point out that the energy budget is what's giving this away here, is that we're making some sort of we're missing something important, because we get out more than we put in, and you're not supposed to be able to do that. So something here is unaccounted for. So what do we get? What do we get for free? We get static patterns like fractals and Halley plots and the digits of E and things like that. We get pattern trajectories. So for example, the Xenobot developmental series. We get behavioral competencies. We get delayed gratification, robustness, memory, things like that. Goal states. I didn't have time to go into this, but there's some interesting goal states that appear that you don't put in by hand. Maybe some other stuff, maybe compute. I don't know about this yet, but we're testing whether you can actually do computations in that space, so like arbitrary computations. That would be pretty amazing. So we don't know, but we don't know about this, but we do know that we get a whole bunch of stuff that looks to be free because we have not been accounting for it in our standard models. So my point on the diverse intelligence front has always been that pretty much any combination of evolved material, engineered material, and software is some kind of viable agent. So cyborgs, hybrids, all these kind of things are going to be living with us. The space of natural forms, Darwin's endless forms most beautiful, is like a tiny a blip in this enormous space. But all of them, but it gets even weirder, because all of these embodiments, and these are physical embodiments, get the benefit of becoming an interface for these ingressing patterns, which we really don't understand very well. We've now been designing tools to help us explore what's going on here. And just to show you one such tool, we call this thing Mombot. And it's the first, to my knowledge, it's the first embodied AI that works in synthetic morphology. So there are lab automation tools that work in like chemistry and molecular biology and things like that. This thing works in synthetic morphology. It actually makes hypotheses about what to say to frog cells to make them be different kinds of constructions. Then it carries out the experiments by providing stimuli in each of these wells. It provides stimuli to the cells, and then it learns. It characterizes what it's made, and it learns what went right, what went wrong, changes its hypotheses, and tries again. So it does these cycles. So it's a discovery platform, but it's also an autonomous robot scientist that's something between a collaborator and a tool that we use. I don't know where it fits on that line, but so the last thing I'll say is that there are three perspectives on this Mombot, and I think it's very valuable to be able to shift perspectives like this. First, we can think about it as the node, the nexus between human scientists and cell collective intelligences. So it's a communications platform that allows us as scientists to better communicate with cells, to get them to make new kinds of biobots, eventually new organs for regenerative medicine and so on. So it's a translation device that helps us communicate with the cells. Okay, that's fine. Here's another idea. Maybe what's actually also happening is that the Mombot itself is the agent. And because it's an embodied agent, it uses the frog tissue to navigate, not three-dimensional space. It doesn't move in our lab. It sits in one place in 3D space, but it does navigate the space of possible form and function. So this intelligence has a body. The physical box in our lab is incidental. What's important is that it allows it. It's like that. It's like the skateboard. It allows it to use the biological tissue to explore that morphospace and to see what other patterns it can pick up. And so maybe really it is the skateboard. So for the Xenobots, the Mombot is the prosthetic. I mean, a hell of a lot more interesting than a passive skateboard, but it is the prosthetic that allows Xenobots to gain new abilities. And really, probably what's driving are the latent patterns that are inside the Xenobots, and then using the Mombot to actually release new patterns. So maybe it's a prosthetic. So I would just thank the postdocs and the students who did all the work. Here they are, all the amazing people who did the stuff I showed you today. in close collaboration with Josh Bongard's lab at University of Vermont on Mombot and all things AI. We have some funders. Here's a disclosure. So Fauna Systems is commercializing some of the stuff that I showed you today. So that's the talk. Fundamentally, I think there's this really interesting developing story of free lunches and their source, and that we really need to understand what kinds of things you can get, what is the mapping between the different embodiments that we create and the patterns that we pull down, and the implications that it has for AIs, for biobots, for swarm robotics, Internet of Things, social and financial structures that we all make. All of these things are interfaces for various kinds of bodies. And so the final thing I want to do is take a couple minutes. Addy sent me some questions, and so I'm just going to do some free association on these. So let's see. The first one, are patterns just an interface for control? Not sure I understand the question exactly, but I think that different kinds of physical patterns, so physical embodiments, in some sense resonate or are compatible with different patterns from this Platonic space. And the degree of compatibility is what we see when we are able to actually uncover these free lunches. I think that's what's happening. Patterns being discrete or continuous, I personally think it's a lot more about the observer. So I think for different purposes, the observer can take different frames that assigns names to specific regions of what I think is fundamentally a continuous measure. I think almost everything interesting is continuous. So, we humans, when we want to set up a court system, we invent an idea of an adult. And the adult, we've decided, begins on your 18th birthday. We all know nothing actually happens on your 18th birthday. We also know that major problems of personal responsibility and what it means when you've had a bad upbringing, too many Twinkies, a brain tumor, drugs, what that does to this notion of personal responsibility. But for the purposes of court, we're just going to say 18, you're an adult and you're responsible. So I think that's what's happening. I think it's mostly about the observer and pragmatic needs of observers to put labels on things, but fundamentally, I think everything's continuous. Let's see. What type of problems are patterns solving? I think we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of the problems they're solving, and I think there's a really interesting question to be had about what do they think the problems are. So your mind coming through an embryo and then a baby, a human baby, tries to infer the outside world, and at first it doesn't make any sense. Eventually, you build a world model that is reasonably successful, and so you think it has some bearing on the reality, quote unquote, of what's going on. But because all feedback is fundamentally somewhat sparse, I think we never actually know. I think naive realism is not viable, and I don't know what it's like to be these other patterns projecting through other interfaces, and what problems they think they're solving. We assign names to the problems we think they're solving, but that doesn't mean that's what they see. And this is a major unsolved question about taking the first person perspective of some of these unconventional beings and asking about what is it that, how do they see their world? And I think that's a really interesting problem. Does it mean that patterns and rhythms and so on are technically non-physical? I mean, yes, I take a very radical view on this. I think physicalism is false. I think we already knew it was false since the time of Pythagoras, because there are facts and truths of mathematics that are not changeable by anything we do in the physical world. They come from a different latent space. And I really do think that all these patterns originate. They don't. I think emergence is a bad way to think about it. I don't think they originate in physical dynamics. I think they are fundamentally non-physical, but they have the ability to have causal influence. I don't think they're epiphenomenal. I think they have the ability to have causal influence on certain physical embodiments. And that requires updating our notion of causation, which is something else that we're working on. Why do patterns and paradoxes both exist? I mean, I'm not sure if there are fundamentally any paradoxes. One paper that we will have coming out in about a month or two has to do with training English sentences or logic sentences, and I'm not kidding. Turns out that logic can be trained as well. It has the ability to learn, and there we encounter this idea that you can have a paradox. Let's take a simple one like the liar paradox. So this sentence is false, right? That's a paradox. Well, it's only a paradox if you, as an observer, insist on a stable meaning that doesn't change. Then you have a problem. If you allow it to have time, then it's basically just a recursive function that oscillates true false true false true false. And if you're okay as an observer with an oscillator, then there is no paradox and it's fine. So and those are the kinds of things that can be trained as dynamical systems. So I suspect that paradoxes are fundamentally in the mind of an observer. I don't know if there's really any paradoxes. Let's see. Are there things that we've seen that look or behave like music, are not classified? I mean, I think this is very much in the eye of the beholder. I think most of us have had the experience of being teenagers and listening to something that your parents are like, what is that shit? That's definitely not music. And you think, of course it's music. You guys just don't get it. So I suspect everything is like that. I think that fundamentally music is a pretty good analogy for things. Dennis Noble in his book The Tune of Life like mines all these analogies. Yeah, I think it's pretty good. I think most of these things behave like music. I mean, I don't have a background in musicology or anything, but to my naive reading, I think a lot of these things look like music. We have, by the way, efforts to sonify the data that we're seeing. So Xenobot behaviors sonified as sounds and so on. Maybe by next year I'll be able to bring you some of those and play them. Right now they're not very pleasant to listen to. Let's see. And how and why do patterns need variation? I don't know that they need variation. I think there's huge variety in these patterns, and I think that certain kinds of patterns thrive when there is a specific kind of variation. So whether those be evolutionary dynamics or learning that readjusts dynamical states and so on. I think those are really attractive for certain kinds of patterns. Okay, I think that's it. Thanks very much, and thank you for listening.